What makes me most proud is how I played the game. And being real, authentic, and spontaneous, and loving the game, to me, is what it was all about.
Brett Favre built his legacy on fearless throws and impossible comebacks. But behind all the glory were battles that left scars. For every touchdown he celebrated, there were rivals who pushed him to the edge, testing his patience, his pride, and sometimes his temper. These weren't just tough opponents. They were the ones who got under his skin, the names that still spark debate whenever Favre's career is remembered. Brett Favre's career was full of unforgettable battles, and today we're pulling back the curtain on the rivals he truly couldn't stand. Stick around, and if you love NFL history and legendary stories like this, hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next one. Here are the 6 rivals Brett Favre hated the most and the dramatic stories behind each grudge. Number 6. Brian Urlacher. When you think of Brett Favre's career, one rivalry that never cooled down was the Green Bay Packers against the Chicago Bears. And in the 2000s, the man who embodied that battle was Brian Urlacher. Urlacher wasn't just another linebacker. He was the face of Chicago's defense, a mix of size, speed, and intimidation that quarterbacks dreaded. For Brett Favre, lining up against Urlacher was never just another Sunday. It was a test of willpower. Favre had been punishing the Bears since the early 1990s, so when Urlacher arrived in 2000, he inherited years of frustration from a fan base tired of watching Favre run wild. Every Packers-Bears game in that era felt bigger than football. It wasn't just two franchises meeting, it was Favre against Urlacher, pride of Green Bay against the warrior of Chicago. One of the defining moments of their rivalry came in 2007 at Soldier Field. The Packers were contending, and Favre, even deep into his 30s, was still throwing with the same reckless energy. But Urlacher wasn't going to let him control the game. He stepped in front of a pass, picked Favre off, and sprinted nearly 90 yards back the other way. The crowd erupted, and that single play summed up what made Urlacher such a nightmare. Favre's daring throws colliding with Urlacher's discipline and instincts. The contrast between them is what made every clash unforgettable. Favre was emotional, unpredictable, and always chasing the big play, no matter the risk. Urlacher was calculated, patient, and ready to pounce when Favre gambled too much. Favre threw more interceptions against the Bears than any other team in his career, and Urlacher was a major reason why. Each turnover against him carried extra weight, not just because it hurt the Packers, but because it fueled the fire of the league's oldest rivalry. Still, as much as Urlacher frustrated him, Favre often found ways to come out on top. He finished his career with 22 wins against the Bears, proving that even when Urlacher played at his peak, Favre's grit and stubbornness could tilt the balance back toward Green Bay. But fans on both sides will tell you the same thing. Whenever Favre faced the Bears, Urlacher was the shadow looming over every snap. If Urlacher symbolized tradition, the old bitter blood feud between the Packers and the Bears, the next name on the list represents a controversy that never went away. A defensive end whose record-breaking sack sparked debate, bitterness, and accusations that followed Brett Favre for years. Number 5. Michael Strahan. Some rivalries are born out of sheer competition, but others are born out of controversy. For Brett Favre, his history with Michael Strahan will forever live in that second category. Strahan was the New York Giants' defensive leader, a relentless pass rusher who made life miserable for every quarterback in the league. And for years, Favre had to keep one eye on him every time he dropped back to throw. But their connection isn't remembered for just sacks or big plays. It's remembered for one sack, the most controversial in NFL history. The year was 2001, and Michael Strahan was on the verge of breaking Mark Gastineau's single-season sack record. He needed one more to reach 22 and set the mark. The Giants' final game was against Brett Favre and the Green Bay Packers, and everyone knew Strahan was coming after him. Late in that game, Favre rolled out to his right. Strahan closed in, and instead of throwing the ball away or scrambling out of bounds, Favre tucked it and slid right into Strahan's arms. It looked too easy. Far too easy for a quarterback as competitive as Favre. Strahan was credited with the record-breaking sack. The crowd went wild, and the moment was sealed in history. But for years afterward, people wondered, Did Favre give Strahan the record? The whispers turned into debates, and the debates turned into grudges. Gastineau himself was furious, calling the play a fraud and accusing Favre of tainting the record. Fans piled on, claiming Favre threw away the integrity of the game to help out a friend. And while Favre denied that he gave Strahan the sack, the image stuck. Brett Favre sliding down as Strahan closed in, making the record look like a gift. For Favre, it was a nightmare he couldn't shake. He was a competitor known for never giving an inch, and now his name was tied to a record many believed was cheapened. That kind of stain doesn't wash off easily. Even Strahan himself admitted later that Favre probably helped him, though he defended the record as part of the game. For Favre, though, it was one of those grudges that gnawed at his pride. He hated losing, he hated being questioned, and he especially hated being remembered as the guy who gave away history. What makes this rivalry so fascinating is that it wasn't built on personal hatred between the two men. It was built on perception. The idea that Favre, the Iron Man of the NFL, somehow let his guard down and allowed Strahan to write his name in the record books. Favre respected Strahan's talent, no doubt about it, but he couldn't stand how that one play followed him for the rest of his career. The controversy only grew louder when Marc Gastineau confronted Favre years later, telling him directly, "You hurt me." Favre, caught between defending himself and showing sympathy, admitted the situation would never fully leave him. And that's what makes Strahan's place on this list so secure, because whether you believe Favre gave him the sack or not, the controversy still lingers like an open wound. If Strahan's rivalry with Favre was about legacy and pride, the next one was about pure survival. A defensive tackle who didn't just pressure quarterbacks, he crushed them with trash talk, intimidation, and bone-rattling hits. For Brett Favre, no opponent made him grit his teeth more than this one. If you're enjoying stories like this, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. It helps us keep bringing you more legendary NFL rivalries. Number 4. John Randle. If there was ever a player who lived rent-free in Brett Favre's head, it was John Randle. The Minnesota Vikings defensive tackle wasn't just tough. He was chaos wrapped in shoulder pads. With black paint smeared across his face and a mouth that never stopped moving, Randle wasn't simply trying to beat you physically. He wanted to get inside your mind, to make you lose focus before the ball was even snapped. For Brett Favre, who loved playing with confidence and rhythm, Randle was a nightmare. Every time the Packers and Vikings lined up, Favre knew Randle would be waiting to break through the line. And Randle wasn't just good, he was one of the most dominant defensive linemen of the 1990s. He piled up 137.5 career sacks, and no quarterback felt his presence more than Brett Favre. In fact, Randle sacked Favre more than any other quarterback he faced in his career. What made Randle so frustrating was his mix of energy and unpredictability. He would line up on the interior, explode off the snap, and before Favre could even finish his drop back, Randle was already in his face. But it wasn't just the hits. It was the constant chatter. Randle was famous for trash talk, and he directed plenty of it at Favre. He barked, taunted, and laughed, doing anything to throw Favre off his game. And while Favre prided himself on being unshakable, even he admitted Randle had a way of getting under his skin. One of their most unforgettable clashes came in the mid-1990s when the Vikings' defense was peaking. On one play, Randle stormed through the Packers' offensive line and hammered Favre to the turf. As Favre lay there, Randle stood over him, screaming in his face, daring him to get up and try again. It wasn't just a sack. It was psychological warfare. Moments like that burned into Favre's memory because they weren't just about losing yards. They were about losing control. What set Randle apart was how relentless he was. He never took plays off, and that relentless energy meant Favre couldn't relax for a second. Even when the Packers' offensive line thought they had him blocked, Randle would spin out, slip through a gap, and explode into the backfield. For Favre, who thrived on improvisation, Randle was the one defender who always seemed one step ahead. But here's the twist. As much as Favre hated playing against Randle, he couldn't help but respect him. After all, Favre loved toughness, and Randle embodied it every snap. Yet respect doesn't erase frustration. And no matter how many big throws Favre made against Minnesota, he always knew Randle was there, waiting to make him pay. It was a rivalry built on pain, trash talk, and grudges, the kind of battles that defined NFC North football in the 1990s. If John Randle was the wild storm that kept Favre awake at night, the next rival was something darker. This one wasn't about playful trash talk or intimidation. It was about survival, a defense that targeted Favre with vicious hits and a scandal that shook the league to its core. Number 3. New Orleans Saints defense, Bobby McCray and bounty scandal. Some rivalries are built on years of history, but Brett Favre's battles with the New Orleans Saints boiled down to one night, one brutal, unforgettable night that nearly ended his career. It was the 2009 NFC Championship game, and Favre, now leading the Minnesota Vikings, was one win away from taking his new team to the Super Bowl. For a 40-year-old quarterback chasing one last shot at glory, everything was on the line. But what he didn't know was that he was walking into a storm of controversy that would later be known as the bounty scandal. From the opening kickoff, the Saints' defense played like men possessed. Their mission wasn't just to stop Favre, it was to punish him. Defensive end Bobby McCray delivered some of the hardest hits of the night, crashing into Favre over and over again. Some of the shots came after he had already released the ball, the kind of late hits that usually draw flags. But that night, the whistles stayed silent, and Favre took a beating unlike anything fans had ever seen. The most infamous moment came in the third quarter. Favre rolled out to his right, trying to extend the play, when McCray came low and another defender came high. Favre was sandwiched between them, twisting awkwardly as he hit the turf. He got up limping badly, his ankle swollen and purple by the end of the game. But in true Favre fashion, he refused to come out. He kept playing, kept throwing, even when every step made him wince. That toughness became legendary, but it also fueled the bitterness of this rivalry. After the game, reports began to surface that the Saints defense had been running a bounty program, paying players bonuses for knocking opponents out of games. And Favre, who had been targeted all night, was at the center of the storm. Bobby McCray's hits, along with others, were suddenly seen in a new light. Were they just aggressive football plays, or were they part of a plan to take Favre out at all costs? The NFL would eventually punish the Saints severely. Coaches and players were suspended, and the scandal became one of the ugliest chapters in league history. For Favre, though, the damage was already done. That game was his last real shot at a Super Bowl, and it slipped away in overtime. He finished with bruises, an interception that sealed the loss, and the knowledge that he may have been the target of something far bigger than just hard-nosed defense. What made this rivalry so bitter wasn't that the Saints and Favre had a long history. It was that this one game left scars that would never heal. Favre was already known as the toughest quarterback in the league, but even he admitted later that the hits he took that night were some of the worst of his career. And when fans look back, they don't just see a heartbreaking loss. They see one of the greatest quarterbacks ever robbed of his chance by a defense willing to cross the line. The Saints symbolized danger and betrayal. The next rival was different. This one wasn't about scandal or cheap shots. It was about two larger-than-life personalities colliding. A defensive lineman who loved trash talk as much as bone-crunching hits, and a quarterback who refused to be intimidated. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this breakdown of Brett Favre's fiercest rivals, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss the next story. And tell me in the comments, do you think the Saints went too far in that 2009 game, or was it just hard-nosed football? I'll be checking what you have to say. Number 2. Warren Sapp. If there was ever a defender who could match Brett Favre's fire, it was Warren Sapp. The legendary defensive tackle for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers was loud, brash, and mean, and that was before the ball was even snapped. He didn't just hit you, he let you know he was coming, and he made sure you remembered it long after the whistle blew. For Favre, who prided himself on toughness and grit, facing Sapp was like staring into a mirror. Except this mirror was 6'2", 300 pounds, and trying to break you in half. The rivalry between the Packers and Buccaneers burned hottest in the late 1990s and early 2000s, back when Tampa Bay was part of the NFC Central. That meant Favre and Sapp met twice every season, and every time it was a battle. Sapp's job was simple: pressure Favre, hit him, frustrate him, and if possible, humiliate him. And he did it often. What made Sapp different was his personality. He was a world-class trash talker, and he loved getting under Favre's skin. He would yell, laugh, and taunt before and after plays, making sure Favre knew he was there. And unlike a lot of defenders, Sapp could back it up. He was explosive off the line, using a rare combination of speed and power to collapse the pocket. Favre could feel his presence on every dropback, and more often than not, Sapp found a way to get a hand on him. One of their most heated clashes came in 2002. Late in the season, Sapp drilled Favre with a hit that Favre thought was late. The two jawed at each other, face to face, their helmets nearly colliding as referees tried to separate them. Favre shouted, Sapp laughed, and the moment captured everything about their rivalry. It wasn't just about sacks, it was about pride. The funny thing was, for all the bad blood on the field, there was also a strange kind of respect. Both men played the game the same way, full throttle, no apologies. Favre never backed down from a hit, and Sapp never backed down from the spotlight. After years of collisions, Sapp would later admit that Favre was one of the toughest quarterbacks he ever faced. And Favre, for all his anger in those moments, said Sapp was one of the top 3 defensive players he ever lined up against. Still, make no mistake, in the heat of battle, there was no love lost. Sapp embodied everything that could make a quarterback miserable, and Favre hated him for it. The two men brought out the best and the worst in each other, and fans were lucky enough to watch it unfold twice a year in one of the NFL's most underrated rivalries. If Warren Sapp was the fiery rival who tested Favre's toughness every season, the final name on this list cut even deeper. This wasn't just about hard hits or trash talk. It was about betrayal, bitterness, and a wound that never fully healed. A man whose anger at Brett Favre exploded years later in public, tied to one of the most controversial records in NFL history. Number 1. Mark Gastineau. Some rivalries fade when the game is over. This one didn't. Brett Favre's most bitter grudge didn't come from a division opponent, a playoff clash, or even a Super Bowl heartbreak. It came from a single play, one that rewrote the record books and left a Hall of Famer feeling betrayed. At the center of it all was Mark Gastineau, one of the greatest pass rushers of the 1980s. Gastineau had set the single-season sack record back in 1984 with 22 sacks, and for nearly 2 decades, no one had touched it. Then came 2001. Michael Strahan of the New York Giants was chasing the record, and in the final game of the season, his last chance was against Brett Favre and the Green Bay Packers. What happened next became one of the most infamous moments in NFL history. Late in the game, Favre rolled out to his right. Instead of throwing the ball away or scrambling to safety, he slid softly into Strahan's arms. Strahan was credited with the sack, the record was his, and the crowd erupted in celebration. But for Gastineau, watching from home, it was a gut punch. He felt cheated, like Favre had handed Strahan the record instead of making him earn it. For years, the controversy simmered. Fans debated whether Favre had gifted Strahan the sack. Strahan defended it. Favre brushed it off, insisting he hadn't meant to give anything away. But Gastineau never forgave him. He carried that anger for more than a decade. And then, years later, the grudge boiled over in public. At a Hall of Fame ceremony, Gastineau confronted Favre face to face. In front of others, he told Favre, "You hurt me." His voice cracked with emotion, not just anger, but heartbreak. For Gastineau, that record had defined his career, and he believed Favre had cheapened it. The exchange shocked people, seeing two legends, years removed from the game, still caught in the heat of one controversial moment. Favre, blindsided, tried to defend himself. He insisted he had never intended to disrespect Gastineau's legacy. In fact, Favre later went out of his way to speak kindly of him, even calling for Gastineau to be considered for the Hall of Fame. But the damage was done. No matter what Favre said, the image of him sliding down in front of Strahan lived on, and for Gastineau, that was unforgivable. What makes this rivalry the most dramatic of all is that it wasn't about two men colliding on the field week after week. It was about history. It was about legacy. Brett Favre found himself at the center of a moment that altered how people remembered not just Michael Strahan, but Mark Gastineau too. And instead of being celebrated as the quarterback who fought to the end, Favre became the villain in another man's story. For Brett Favre, there were plenty of rivals who hit him hard, who picked him off, or who made his Sundays miserable. But Mark Gastineau's grudge was different. It followed him long after he retired, proving that sometimes the fiercest rivalries aren't settled on the field. They're settled in memory, in pride, and in scars that never fade. These rivalries weren't just football games. They were battles of pride, toughness, and legacy that shaped Brett Favre's career. From Brian Urlacher carrying the weight of Chicago, to Michael Strahan's record-breaking sack, to John Randall's relentless pressure and the brutal night against the Saints, all the way to Warren Sapp's trash talk and Mark Gastineau's unforgettable grudge, Each one left a mark on Favre's story. They remind us that greatness doesn't come without enemies, and that even legends like Favre had rivals who tested him, hurt him, and sometimes haunted him. But those same battles are what made him unforgettable, the quarterback who refused to back down no matter who lined up across from him. Now it's your turn. Which of these rivals do you think gave Brett Favre the biggest headache? Or is there someone we left off the list that deserves a spot? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss more legendary NFL stories.